Piyush Mehta, CEO of Data Dynamics. Welcome to the Insight Jam.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here because there's so much obviously going on in this data space these days. Why don't we start with a quick little overview of what you see as a state of enterprise data management?
It's a really exciting time, simply because of the fact that AI has added a completely new nuance to the concept of how important data becomes as an asset. And if you listen to every C-level conversation and every board-level conversation for that matter, it's driven by what are we doing in the world of AI. And at the end of that, the core to that AI drive is around data. So data has become not only the new oil, it's literally become the new oil, gold, platinum, and all of the above. And what we're finding in the enterprise world is a focus on making sure that there is a better understanding of the data they have so that they can be ensuring that the AI models are properly curated with the right data. And the other aspect that we're seeing quite a bit of, which is really interesting, tied to global economic conditions as well as geopolitical conditions, is the concept of data sovereignty coming into play. So that's also playing into the world of enterprise data management as you think about at companies that have geographic disbursement across a multitude of countries and having to make sure that the sovereignty issue is addressed in a digital context tied to a physical geography, which is a very interesting play.
And this has been going on for some time now, almost certainly pre-pandemic with GDPR and so forth. But talk a little bit more about what the concept is with regard to data sovereignty, because I think this is I think this is the beginning of a lot of change in how we think about data and who owns data and who is responsible for data.
I believe that if you think about physical immigration as something that people used to worry about, now they think of data immigration or emigration as a key security concern. And it's a concern because they believe that my people's data and the population's data is a national asset and it's a national security concern. So can I take that information and create exposure that leads to vulnerability, either through the heuristics based on a certain trend that I find, as well as just can I use the personal information to exploit financially? And what you've seen is over 50 countries deploying national sovereignty laws or in the process of deploying them and creating these digital barriers. And the digital barriers tied to geographic clear structures that say, hey, you cannot take data that belongs to an Indian citizen, for example, out of India. They passed last August, the DPDP Act. And that's just an example, and it's an extension of GDPR that's been in Europe for a while. It's an extension to many of the state acts that you see in the US, right, around privacy and protection laws, but are taken very seriously in the context of national sovereignty. South Korea, Brazil, Russia, China, obviously, Vietnam, and so on. So if you think about the enterprise, think of them as data custodians. They are holding the data on behalf of customers, their customers, maybe internal employees. That custodialship is governed by the national regulation that's set. So regardless of the independence of saying I am a bank or I am XYZ corporation that may have the right to the data, their rights are limited and governed by the national interest taking priority. So even though I may be a large company, and I'll just continue to use India as an example, based on, let's say I'm a bank out of India and I have locations that are in other countries as well. If I have Indian citizens' information, I can't just say I'm going to store it in a hyperscaler in Germany. I have to make sure that that data resides within the confines of the Indian geographic border, because that's a regulatory requirement now. It's not a
license. But is it just a copy of the data? I mean, the data is such a slippery slope
Well,
because it's so is it just simply a copy of the data? So all you need is just one version of that data to sit in that.
it's actually the other way, Doug, which is if you decide to take any version of that data out, you have to be able to justify why. So the question becomes, why do you need to take it out?
Despite whether or not the individual
Would give consent.
give consent. So the individual is subordinate to the national sovereign
National
act.
interest has more value. And the reasoning and the logic to some extent makes sense, albeit maybe, is taking worst case. But the thought process is, if I have PII information about individuals, and let's just take health records, for example, and I can figure out that this population within this geography of India has this blood type, and I can then create diseases or viruses that attack that blood type, I can make that population vulnerable. Just a worst case hypothetical. And where these countries are going is saying, I can't give you that exposure. Because the minute I say personal information, we initially think credit card, name, maybe passport number. There's an economic impact. But beyond the economic impact, there's a bigger, broader national health impact that also comes into play when you consider PII in a broader sense. And the fear is the minute I allow one, I have to almost allow all. So I'm going to bring that barrier more closer and kind of just clamp it down.
So this is obviously these types of challenges are wonderful for solution providers like yourself. For your clients, though, they must represent, an ice cream headache in terms of trying to understand where they should draw the line. I mean, how are you finding clients? Are they in denial? I think a lot of people, at least the experience with GDPR was, well, I think there's a lot of feeling like it sounds bad, but in the end, nobody's really enforcing anything. And I think it's there's some slippery compliance going on there. I'm curious, what the headspace is around this right now in terms of the client conversations you're having.
I think GDPR had good intentions, but they never actually enforced it in full effect. If you think about it, they maybe slapped a couple of people on the hand and created headlines, but really, was it truly enforced? TBD. I wouldn't say it was. I think
it was selectively enforced to maximize the revenue opportunity.
Right. The intent of protecting citizens from exposure and privacy did not get achieved through GDPR in what their intent was. I think I agree with you that where they could get record fines based on percentage of revenue or what they could make headlines with, absolutely. What you're finding with these other countries is to say, hey, it is table stakes for you to come do business here. You must be a responsible custodian if you want to do business in my country. And that's a very different way of looking at it. I also feel that in GDPR, you have a union of multitude of countries that are coming together. So a much more broad stroke, harder to say, I'm going to implement. But in countries like India, you can really enforce it. And if I'm Amazon, if I am Google, if I am Daimler, and I want to do business there, I don't have a choice but to live by the rules. And if you think about the economies that I mentioned, Korea or India or Brazil, or any of these countries that I said are building national regulations, they're massive economies and massive growth economies. You can't do business if you're not in there and expect growth. So you kind of have to live by the rules.
And what if you're already doing business there? What if you're fully operational, a global organization, you've got what you consider to be data management best practices already in place, but they are not compliant with this particular new approach?
That's the challenge that every one of our prospects and customers faces. And that's where they're bringing people like us in to say, hey, how do I get my hands around this? Because I have data that goes back decades. It's sprawled at a geographic. I have a single customer that's in 120 countries. easier said than done. And then you look at the pocket closet data centers. The big data centers, I can maybe grasp and say, okay, I got 6 of those. But the other 114 that I got to go look at where data may reside and figure out, for example, in one case, Angola. Well, Angola has a data privacy requirement, and you can't take data out. And the hyperscaler that they wanted to move to didn't have presence in Angola. So how do I plan out my strategy from a technology, from a use case? People talk broad stroke like AI. Well, AI needs data, but that data needs to be accessible in a central form that I can actually pull from and teach and learn from. And in this case, they just ended up keeping that closet data center because they did do the analysis. They ran that analysis with our software and were able to identify it. But it is a big challenge, and it's a challenge that continues to get more and more rigorous when you think about the sheer sprawl of the number of countries. How do you keep up, right? Each country has their own quote-unquote regulation. And one best practice that I will share with everybody that I think was really, actually was taught to me by Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's one of the eminent data privacy experts in the world. And she said, Piyush, whatever you build with the most stringent requirement of the country in the world. So the country that has the most stringent requirement, if you can meet their laws, you can meet the requirement of every country.
So who is that? Who is the standard of most compliance at this point?
There is so South Korea has very stringent laws that are pretty good. India is interesting. Brazil has very, very strong data privacy requirements. As Canada has decent data privacy. I think the most lenient is the U.S.
Yes, well, that's a. So my issue with data stewardship in the United States, anyway, is that there doesn't seem to be any consequence whatsoever to companies suffering data breaches, and they're happening over and over and over again, larger and larger. I think we've all been breached. All of our data has been breached multiple times over, including our government data. Right. And nobody, as far as I can tell, I mean, there are some fines and certainly some, some token enforcement or whatever, token penalties. But that's my issue is the lack of consequence in the United States. It's not even, I mean, I think it'll always, given the political issues, it'll always be state driven, I would expect. Although you never know. The way AI is headed and the sovereign advantages that will come from data control, maybe the United States will toughen up there a little bit, or at least tighten up.
I feel that, at least, and maybe this is my accounting finance background, I feel unless it impacts your stock price in the U.S., it doesn't matter. And until that happens, where the investors say that breach or that leak has an impact to your business because people won't trust you and therefore will not do business with you, and that has a revenue impact, a P&L impact, till that takes place, you will not see a cultural change, just because it takes that level of impact for people here to say, hey, I really need to pay more attention. That being said, I think there is a shift where CISOs are paying a lot of attention in the US and have built phenomenal networks and systems, but they're not looking at it from data up yet. They're looking at it from outside in, not inside out. And when you
in what way? In a security posture or in a analytical?
In a security posture. So from that standpoint, when I say that, if you look at most of the breaches, they are either malicious or inadvertent loss of a file with records in it, loss of a single piece of record that has millions of information fields in it. It's like saying an Excel file is taken out of the environment. How easy or hard is that? It's not about my, massive databases that I'm worried about, because they're pretty well architected and protected. It's the unstructured piece where you're creating that sprawl across your footprint. Your users are creating it, your applications are creating it, and it takes very fractional percentile of that to get exposure to create that void. And, as of now, like you said, in the US, you get a headline for a day, so-and-so had a breach. What happens the next day? Moves on. There isn't that consequence.
It's maddening. That to me is maddening. The cavalier nature with which data is being handled and the lack of consequence around mismanagement is maddening. It really is, because in the end, we're not consenting to that individually. And I have a whole nother theory around how we should all be our own individual stewards. And I'd like to think that at some point in the future, we will be allowed to provide individual consent at a kind of a monetary reimbursement and almost a value exchange. But I won't go down that path.
Well, I will add one thing to that. Maybe this will help cheer you up a little bit, that there is something in the works. So our vision is data democratization. The first step in that journey is to make custodians better stewards of data that they're managing on behalf of their customers. But we extend that with some of the technology that we've built, where we can take and provide consumers direct control and access to the consent of accessing data by the custodians, against which there's a digital wallet. So you can see where this can allow you to partake.
Okay.
Profit, not a coupon. Hey, here's Whole Foods and give me a 5% off on my next avocado purchase. If you make $1, I make a penny.
Yeah, you're all right. So we're in sync here, because I believe, and I will tell anybody who asks, that we're all worth tens of thousands of dollars in terms of our lead generation value over the course of our lives, from all the things, all the times that all the times that our data is monetized within the whatever demand generation arena, across all the things that we buy, and we see none of it. The simple math was always, well, you'll get five offers in exchange for your data. The old lending tree model of we'll give you a bunch of competitive pricing in order if you give us your data, and then meanwhile they're selling it 5 times over. Maddening. Anyway, I like where you're heading there, and I do believe that maybe in other countries this will be easier. It sounds like in other countries it's been easier to get stricter, more comprehensive data governance. So maybe there'll be other countries that kind of lead the way there. I'd like to think that is where we're headed.
Yeah, we're seeing that more and more. And we're seeing not only countries get extremely serious about this, but they're realizing that in this world that we say is a digital era, data is the biggest asset that they have. How do they protect it? How do they ensure privacy? And for their citizens, giving them the rights and the privacy to a certain extent is more important than physical rights and privacy, because it's that big an impact if something does happen to it, or if some exposure does take place. If I keep saying this to laymen that are not in the technology world, I said, you lose your wallet, you'll make 2 calls and the credit card companies will stop the card numbers and you'll be fine relatively. You lose your digital footprint, and the time it takes to repair credit and the time it takes to repair your credibility could be months, if at all.
Correct.
Depending on what database you got entered into and where that data got sold. And that should be a bigger concern, right? And all of us are so used to, okay, let me go to a website, just press consent or accept because I just want to move on. And we're giving away our rights as part of that process. And it's really important to be conscious of that. And conscious of that from 2 standpoints. One, giving away the rights in and of itself. And secondly, how well is that custodian managing that data, right? If they've been in the headlines over the last 2 years 5 times for data breaches, you really shouldn't give any consent. That's an education process that I just feel like, because it's not going to happen from them unless we drive it.
Well, so you're in the crosshairs of a couple of evolutions right now. Certainly the evolution of cybersecurity and the constant threat to breaches, but also now with regard to the value that data has on artificial intelligence, being able to roll up large language models with lots of data, and the inevitable demand for organizations to want to stay competitive, and ultimately they will need their data in ways that I don't think they ever planned for in order to take advantage of the AI revolution. I mean, what do you see? What would be your advice to an organization right now? It's always been my opinion, and I go back a ways and have seen a thing or two, that the dirty secret of most organizations is the state of their data. They don't actually like. Everybody says they've got it, sorted out, but they don't. Well, on the whole, right? I mean, some do, I think, but
yeah, I would agree with you. Probably this won't be a comment most of our customers or prospects would like, but enterprises spend billions of dollars every year on tech. But I would say very few, if any, have a grasp on their data. As much as data gets attention, it's also the biggest problem child in most cases. And the one advice I'd give, and what we're seeing also is LLMs have a phenomenal ability to be transformative, but require a lot of feeding, right? It's still infancy.
Well, and they require the good data.
Right. And but if you don't know your data,
it is like feeding a baby. You can't just feed it, junk food. And a lot of this tech that these organizations have been hoovering in for the past 20 years is generating all kinds of data that is, it's just highly processed carbohydrates, bad for your baby.
Very, very well put. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is most enterprises, especially in the financial services, are pausing on LLMs till they can curate the data to make sure what are you touching? And when you say what are you touching, you need to internally know what that data is. So for example, does it have personal information? If it does, as much as an LLM can be localized, the question is, does anything go back into mothership? The second question is, in most enterprises, you have multiple copies of the same data. And when I say multiple, a pretty large percentile, in which case you could skew the model by making it think a certain way based on the propensity of the number or percentage of the same data being there. So you would have hallucinations without knowing it's a hallucination just because the raw data feed is wrong. Because nobody ever cleaned it up. If I had 500 copies of the same file, PowerPoint, that 500 copies is ingested, to your point, as carbs and just gets swallowed up by that LLM. And then that determines what the LLM gives back as an answer, as a response. The other is aged, data that in almost inevitably any company, nobody presses the delete button. Neither do we as human beings. In a laptop, we'll save stuff. We never go back. Whoever goes back and says delete.
Yeah, we don't need to take a look inside my computer right now. Right. There's just no need for that.
And the hard drives keep getting bigger, so we get happier and we move on. It's the same in the enterprise. Customers with hundreds of petabytes of data. Statistically, we've found over 70% of the data in every enterprise we've gone to is not touched in over 3 years. Think about that. Not touched. And it's not surprising. And it's actually getting worse.
Actually, 3 years is not. It's not that long to an enterprise.
No, and the reason that's important is now when you feed the LLM data that may be 20 years old, is that relevant? Exactly. It's not going to access anything it has access to because it's hungry.
It can't possibly be relevant.
Right. Exactly.
Most of it is not only dead; it's completely out of date. Yeah, so here we are talking right now. You're the expert. So what do you say? What do you say to somebody? I mean, what's your first kind of posture with regard to going in and talking to an organization to get their act together on that stuff?
My recommendation to every organization is to first go do the analytics. And when I say do the analytics, understand what you have and be honest with yourself, right? Because many companies will say, well, no, I have it. I understand it. I know it. You're going to have to be honest. And that honesty comes by also making sure that you're breaking the silos within the organization. You have the CISOs who say, hey, it's all about security, and I look at data with my security lens. You have the CDOs who say it's all about classification and the lineage, and I look at that. You have the IT guys who say, I gave you the storage, I'm managing its life cycle, more power to you, how you use it. And then you have your lines of business that have their own perspective on what they want to do with the data. The problem is each one does it in isolation. So you don't have a coherent policy on what is data management, right? If you ask 10 people in a company, you'll get 20 answers. And you probably have 50 tools doing different things based on the lens that you need. So first we need to come to agreement that, hey, let me go scan the data once, but have multiple views to what I can do with it across the various gamuts of corporate organization. And then be able to say, okay, comprehensively, we agree that this is what I have. That's a starting point. Because once we agree to what I have, then you can make decisions on how can I use it? Should I allow its usage? Where's my body's buried? What do I need to really protect? How do I clean this up? Because if you don't do the curation, jumping to modeling, jumping to, sovereignty is irrelevant, because you don't have a base infrastructure against which you're doing that with. So the baseline is understand the data, and that may take months. It's not overnight in large enterprises, because it's years and years of data, multiple petabytes, tens, if not hundreds, spread across, a massive array. We have customers with over 1 trillion files, right? Just think about it, 1 trillion files. It's easy to say, but it's crazy.
It's hard to imagine.
It's hard to imagine. And then you take the geographic considerations, you take the aging considerations, you take, all the different parameters, who owns it into account, including people who are retired and no longer running the application in the mainframe world, right?
Well, so this is the other thing, and this is actually, everybody talks about, and I talk about it too, about how artificial intelligence is going to have a direct impact on replacing human beings in the workforce, and that on the whole is not going to be a good thing for human beings, but truth of the matter is, for the organization itself. To your point, the owners of these, the advocates and the champions of these technologies that have been brought in over the years are long gone.
100%.
And there is no clearinghouse anymore. There is no central decision maker, no owner that can demand data be organized in the way that you described, that's going to stick around for any length of time. So the ultimate job, if I were to project out of who's going to own that, it's going to be an artificial intelligence agent, which I think is probably a good thing for an organization, because at least then it's kind of non-negotiable, or at least it's not prone to human frailty.
Well, I mean, and I'll give you a classic example of that. You'll have customers where the IT team will use the example I gave. Hey, this data is not touched in over 3 years or over 5 years. Why don't you archive or delete it? You go to the actual person who either owns the application or owns the data, and assuming they're there, they will say, well, I may need it.
Right. If they are there, they'll never give it up.
Right.
Or they'll never let you delete it. Right.
Then you have legal come in and say, well, I need to understand what's in it, because there may be a need to retain it for X period of time.
Of course.
And that's a arbitrary decision, not necessarily one that has very clear mindset and rules, because each legal counsel has their own views on this. So it's not like, hey.
It's also lacking any kind of technical perspective.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Which again, an AI agent would be able to synthesize the legal issue with regard to the technical requirements of storing, and potentially the implications for where it should be stored in order to stay compliant, but still keep it out of the, the hallucination zone.
Yep. And then you take that same logic, or that same analogy, I should say, and add a security hat and say, okay, who should have access to this? So you just added multiple paradigms. And to your point, this is a perfect use case for AI, right? Bring the systems in that can actually become systematic in driving that process and break the silos. Because right now it's inefficient anyway.
Well, and honestly, if you think about it, there is no human being, and this is the problem when you get up to the C-suite and maybe not even that high, is the political issues,
Right.
the human political issues, and the corporate political issues that as you were saying, that people are going to make demands around the things that they're responsible for that are not necessarily best for the organization, but they're best for that political position. And ultimately, they have no ability to see the all the requirements of all the other players at the board or at the C level. And when you think about it, that's the perfect example for an AI agent. Is it can synthesize so much information, not only vertically but horizontally, in a very, I mean, actually it's actually, that may be where it winds up is every organization has a chief artificial intelligence officer, but it's not an actual human.
Right. And if you think about it, it adds efficiency, but it also addresses the biases that are created through human beings. Assuming, and with the caveat that it's the right input going into that AI learning agent in order to do so. And that's the key, right? And that's where, when people say AI, and I know every boardroom, the first question to the CEO is, what are we doing with AI? And, what are we doing with generative AI? I think there has to be an acceptance that AI is in its very, very early infancy. And when I say that, we're dealing with a toddler at best. So accept that and know that these are evolving curves that will take years. And by all means, in a very accelerated manner compared to any other technology revolution, because of the self-learning capability that it has the potential to bring, as well as the computing resources that are coming on board between today and then quantum moving down the road. That being said, it's still early. And this is when, in these formative years, if you put the right guardrails, if you put the right structure in place, the yield will be multifold in that investment down the line.
Where do you start when you're talking to an organization? At a certain level, most organizations that you're dealing with are not completely immature. They have had a lot of smart people thinking long and hard about the best way to do things, and their systems are, by all accounts, they would probably say are pretty good. And so how do you get them to think outside of that pretty good paradigm?
It's a tough task. If I had a very clear answer, I'd have a full set of hair still. So what I will say is, we have an honest conversation on saying, today when you manage data, are you siloed? And 9 out of 10 times they will say, yes, we're siloed in how we look at it. We will first take, what is your biggest pain point? So is it a security question of who has access? Is it a lifecycle management of how my storage costs are going out of control? Is it a question of, do I have data sovereignty requirements where my regulators are on my case to fix that? Do I have a compliance issue? Do I have sensitive information in my data that I need to be aware of and address because I have certain internal or external requirements? You take a pain point, and what we tell the customer is, we have a software called Zubin that actually drives this as an aggregated platform. And what we tell the customers to do is first go and analyze the data. At an aggregate level, capture the metadata, who, what, where, why, and understand the heuristics, because that tells you a lot more than you think. Use that as a filter to then narrow into the next narrative, which is, okay, now in this, what am I really looking for? Am I looking within the content? Am I looking at the access and controls on risk from that standpoint? And then apply that search and apply that query and make sure that you're able to then filter through addressing that pain point. But in doing so, as part of this process, tag and classify the data at an aggregate level. Because what that does is it sets structure around the unstructured. And now, whether I'm querying for a particular problem case today or a problem case tomorrow, I have a means to address and search. Because the challenge, as I mentioned, is the sheer sprawl is massive. The amount of data repositories is mind-blowing. And in that, if you have to make head or tail, and each time I have a problem to solve as a single statement, it becomes hard. So we go in and say, take this methodology, solve your problem one, but then know that its applicability of that solution can be across other areas of the business. And that works really well because it also brings together, I think there is an acceptance that it's too siloed today and they can't be effective. And that ineffectiveness is impacting their business because at the end, AI will be the disruptor to how quickly can you respond with that intelligence and be nimble as a business. At the end, that's the answer to the game. That nimbleness is dependent on your organization also making that cultural shift to say, I got to break these barriers. And this is a step towards that. I'm not saying we solve world peace, but you have to have a level playing field that everybody agrees that, yes, this is the data we're looking at. And by the way, this is how we all agree to classify or tag it. You could put different tags on it, but there's a methodology that's consistent. I may look at it from a risk standpoint. You may look at it from an optimization standpoint. A third person may look at it from a curation or PII for AI standpoint. It's a starting point to the journey, and each one then incorporates and uses it in their own way. And that's worked really well with our customers because what it does is it sets a best practice into effect. And it doesn't try to boil the ocean overnight. I'm not saying go rip out the 30 products you're running. Use this for one use case. Make sure that you're comfortable. But as you're doing so, you will define a process that then can be applied consistently across the various areas of the business. And that's important because that drives consistency. It drives a holistic process, a best practice. And it's across geographies. That's also important because otherwise what happens is you still have each country trying to manage their own data in their own way, which is chaotic in terms of, think about it from a central standpoint. How do you manage that when you have 20, 30 countries that you're doing business in?
Well, and if you were just trying to solve one of these problems, it would be hard. But that's the challenge, right? At a certain level in the organization, it's whack-a-mole. I mean, you're trying to solve data security, compliance, then now you're talking data sovereignty country by country if you're an international organization. Meanwhile, you've got data, just kind of good data practices internally that you're trying to implement. And ultimately, everybody is chomping at the bit, looking at you, waiting for you to come up with your AI strategy that's going to keep you competitive for the next 30 years.
Very well.
Any one of those things is hard.
I mean, and the example I gave you, right, where the duplicate number of data points can skew an AI model. That's from an AI perspective. From a storage perspective, it's storage space. So you're only looking at it from an optimization lens. From a security perspective, it's a broader attack plane. The more data that's propagated, the more potential chances of attack against that surface area.
Well, and I mean, truth be told, I mean, when you start to layer in artificial intelligence, the advancements in artificial intelligence with quantum computing, and you get bad actors enabled with these highly powerful tools, just the sheer security challenges are going to be nearly impossible. I had a conversation early on in one of our first podcasts for the Insight Jam, and we talked about how there are going to be certain organizations who will not want to keep data because they won't be able to keep it safely, and there's just no upside anymore to keeping it because there's just no way to protect it from what's coming.
Yeah, I would say if you look at what's the number one challenge in Florida today, insurance premiums. Why? Because of risk of hurricanes coming in and that it's the same thing with data. your cyber risk and your insurance premiums to manage and control that will be at a number that you'll say, wait a minute, why am I keeping this? But that responsibility and that cost is so high.
Right.
That do I really need to be the person accountable or responsible as an entity to do so? And I'll go a step further in that. I'm not as worried about LLMs because I think they take a ton of ingestion. It's the small language models with quantum that you can do massive damage with. Because if you have the vertical knowledge that comes with the small language model, training is easy. Spinning them up is very easy. I can take open source models and tweak them a little bit, and all of a sudden they're powerful engine. And then if I give it the compute power that comes with it, I mean, I can wreak havoc very, very quickly. And I think that's what we should all be worried about. I'm not as worried about BERT and OpenAI as much as I'm worried about the smaller models that can be spun up easily and doesn't even need that big an infrastructure to go deploy and hide within an environment like an enterprise and go pull this out.
Truth be told, I mean, when you just see the trajectory of the attack sophistication, there's no, I mean, as long as there's money to be made, there's no stopping it. Then there's no reason why they would hold fast at the levels they're at. They're just going to get more sophisticated because there's just too much upside to the bad actors. And then you layer in what nation states are going to be developing. And we've already seen some nation state technology reach the wild. And there you have it. I don't see it going well for. So what's your advice? I mean, it's going to be a wild world. So you've had that. With the time we have left, I'd love to get your perspective on this because you've had a long journey. You've gotten to this point. You clearly have an interesting perspective on things. But there are a bunch of younger folks who are going to have to deal with this. You and I aren't going to have to deal with a lot of this stuff, right? But in the next 20 or 30 years, there are going to be a lot of young folks who are going to have to deal with not only the pressures of that artificial intelligence will bring to bear on their careers, but just in general. I mean, what advice do you give to somebody who's thinking about getting into the technology game at this point? I mean, where do you see the opportunities? It's my understanding coding is not going to exist. I mean, where are the opportunities?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think development as we know it today in terms of software development is going to have a paradigm shift where the amount of resource required is going to be minimal. It is this same as an antiquated assembly line versus robotics coming in and taking over a lot of those jobs. So I believe that that's absolutely a given. And it may take a while, and I say a while, 5 to 7 years in order for that shift, but it is going to happen. And to that extent, I always say this to, countries like India rely heavily on that service economy. How do you take that working middle class that's been developed as a result of technology being a backbone? And when automation comes in, what jobs do they replace them with, right? Well, how do you give them a new job, and what is that going to be?
So what jobs do they? I mean, there are. I think I saw that there was 5.5 million software developers in India. There's probably more than that. But you take out 20% of just the low end stuff, and you're wiping out 1 million people who have invested in their education, have an extremely good job in society, and now they have nothing to do. And like, how do you and plus you're taking away all the bottom rungs of a ladder that has been traditionally a classic path up to sea level.
Well, it started with business process outsourcing, right? So the call centers. And if you think that's the first thing going away with generative AI, I can have an interactive conversation without having a human being on the other side. Development is the second. The one advice I give to almost every person that asks me is I believe that two key things are going to be tied to technology. One is environmental science. Like it, don't like it, believe it, don't believe it. It's reality, and it's here to be solved, and it has to be solved in the very soon foreseeable future, because the cost of not solving is going to impact P&Ls and balance sheets. And that's when the firms are going to wake up and say, it's not a checkbox to say ESG. I really do need to address it. So I would recommend every person that has the opportunity to get educated to do a minor in environmental studies or a major and use technology as an enabler to drive that, because that's going to be. And the other is biotech. I mean, if you think about biotech and the science behind what we're doing to drive individual medication, individual surgery, that's specific body parts created just for us based on our DNA and based on our profile. I think that is the future. And those two areas, again, at the end still require technology. So although they are specific genre or verticals that I'm mentioning, they still require technology, whether it be coding, whether it be algorithmic understanding, whether it be developing of models that fine-tune to meet that, I think is a must-have. And I think if you can drive either of those paradigms, you should have a job for the future, at least for the next generation.
I mean, well, tell us a little bit about your path. So you're CEO. You've been running this. You founded it 12 years ago, 13 years ago. You've been running this company now as CEO for over a decade. Were there any decisions along the way that you remember making that were kind of forks in the road where you went left instead of right? And, you know, it was a very specific decision that you made, and any reasons why you thought about that? I mean, what were some of the most significant moments in that journey?
Every CEO in a growth company has that fork in the road every day in some form or another. What I will say is you make the best decision at that point in time with the knowledge you have. Right or wrong is something that comes in the rearview mirror after the fact, but you try to make the best decisions. In our case, we are led by a CEO in me that is not technical in terms of my education. So I'm an accounting finance major by profession, quote unquote, even though this is my third tech company. And as such, it's important to note that I'm driven by the customer use case as a key parameter to determine what we build next. Where are the customer pain points? I'm not building and saying they will come, because I don't have that mindset and luxury to have that smart level of thinking. So I am going and talking to our customers. And I think that's important because, as we look at where we kind of made decisions, we've always made the customer first in our decision-making power. We've had technologists who said, oh, we should do this. But when you go and say, hey, where's the customer's head at? And what are their pain points? You end up usually at least getting far more practical solutions to market. You may not solve world peace overnight, but you're definitely addressing the pain points of today.
So how do you synthesize that, or how do you get a consistency to the point where you can begin to see a trend line or some sort of a consensus around where your customers' heads are at? I'm curious.
So we
at some point you do need more than one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we have been fortunate and are privileged to have some of the largest enterprise customers in the world, 28 of the Fortune 100, 6 of the top 10 banks, 2 of the top 5 energy companies. And what happens as a result is you see a common theme. When you talk to enough of them, you see a common trend that many times may be vertical based, most of the time is across verticals. It's agnostic to the ones and zeros that you're touching. And it's a common problem. Data sovereignty is a common problem, public or private sector.
Now, do you wait for them to bring it up, or are you throwing these kind of?
So it's a combination. So we work with analysts, understand how they're seeing trends because they have a broader base that they're looking at. We then take that back into our customers and say, hey, how many of you are seeing this, or how many of you are bringing this up? And we use that as a yardstick. We also work a lot with our channel partners and say, hey, can you go check how many of your customers are seeing this? And then that becomes an ingestion into our product management strategy of what are we rolling out over the next 12 months. And that's a continual loop that takes place.
How do you do it? Do you have account teams? Do you have a council that you're that you're consulting with? I mean, or do you have just straight up consultants? I mean, how do you do it practically speaking? How do you kind of
So
get
we
that
have
pulse?
a customer technology advisory board, which allows us to get really good input and insights to leverage. We leverage forums where we go and speak to customers. We host very specific roundtables, with just a limited number of folks. And it's around not about us, but about understanding the problem statements and seeing that. And then we obviously leverage the analyst community and our customers overall. But that's a byproduct of these three things taking place. And these three things, along with what I said earlier, allows us to get enough insight to be able to offer educated solutions that can bring value.
And then how do you bring that back to your organization and start to drive some product development there?
So we make sure that the product management team is engaged in this process. Our chief strategy officer is engaged. Our product management team is engaged. Our lead architects/developers are engaged in this process. We have them sometimes be silent listeners on customer calls in terms of getting that feedback. Because when you hear it from the horse's mouth, it's very different than the interpretation I may give or my colleagues may give internally. And then there's the, oh my God moment. There's a bulb that clicks that says, yes, now I get it. And that allows us to make sure that what we're building really does address the problem statement rather than having an interpretive view of it and then there being a disconnect.
As you have seen this pandemic kind of spool out and the workforce change a little bit, I'm a bit of an old school guy. I still believe there's value in the organic nature of working together in an office. I'm curious, how have you guys kind of wound up at the end of all of this? Were you in the office prior to the pandemic? Are you out of the office, hybrid, back in the office? What's your position on that?
I'm in full agreement with you. I think the swivel chair and asking a question, the conversation around a pot of coffee or around the water cooler is priceless. And you can't do that over any kind of virtual media. It's hard though, because what's happened is culturally, and it's amazing how human beings, right? In 2 years of working from home, people have gotten used to that becoming their habit. And to some extent, I get it because productivity hasn't been impacted as much in the short run. They're working more hours in certain cases because you wake up and you sit and then you don't move. But at the same time, what you miss and what you lose is the camaraderie, the feeling of we are one company, the feeling that we all work under one organizational structure, because now we're all independent in terms of just working in that isolation. And you don't build friendships. And when you don't build friendships, it's hard to build trust as working relationships. So, when Dev and QA go head to head, when you have that ability to say, hey, are you out of your mind? You're nuts. And be able to say it with the other person taking it with a sense of respect that, hey, he's just saying it with in a jovial way. It's different than saying it when you've never met the person. We have deployed a hybrid model now where we're saying 3 days a week, you should be back in the office. But it's still very hard to enforce. To be honest, it's hard because people have gotten used to kind of not commuting, right? So now,
and I think a lot of them just moved further away to the point where it's like, what are you going to do?
Well, and I don't think anybody has it right? I mean, the banks and others are trying for 5-day weeks and whatnot. People are just not used to it. So they are going to do it till they find an alternative job. And if they can find one that allows them not to do it, they'll do it. If the economy slows down and there's no other option, then guess what? They'll commute in. But, I think hybrid is probably the future. And I highly encourage at least the youngsters in the labor force to go in more. I mean, the senior guys like us, okay, whether we go in or not, maybe we know how it works. But if I'm in my 20s, or even if I'm in my 30s, I should want to go every day and meet as many people as I possibly could.
I couldn't agree with you more. I have two sons who both graduated post-pandemic. One graduated the year after the pandemic and the other right after that, and went into jobs that were completely remote. And it really messed with them because they
Right.
couldn't get a read on who they were working with. And they would say, I think this person understands me and I think they're getting what they want from me, but they haven't made a connection. There's no soft relationship there beyond, I want this from you. Here's my deliverable back. And I just think, and I've seen them struggle with it. And they both, when they had the opportunity to go in, both went in because.
That's great.
And truth of the matter is there's never been a more important time for you to be in the office as a young person because you want to hear what's going on with the way the organizations are changing, because these organizations are all going to change. They're all being influenced and new tools are coming. I think I just saw a number that said something along the lines of $3.7 billion have been invested in just the last year in AI startups. All those dollars are building products that are coming next year and the year after that. The salespeople haven't arrived yet. They're just being hired. But when they start to arrive, man, the world is going to change. These organizations are going to have tools that they never imagined having, and it is going to have direct impact on departments of people and classifications of people. And you're going to want to know, you're going to want to hear it at the what the guys on the 15th floor are doing to the guys on the 9th floor. You know what I mean? There's
100%.
There's
you want to be the elevator and hope that you meet a senior executive and shake their hand and say hello, versus not even knowing who they are except a picture on the website.
Well, that's another thing. So, do you do anything like that? I know my son was just saying that he's it's a smaller organization, but they have a couple hundred people. He said the CEO has now asked him to go out to lunch a couple times over the last couple months. Monthly meetings, which I thought was great, a great thought, and because they are making a human connection.
Yep.
Do you get a chance to do that, or is that how you think about it?
Yeah, everywhere we have teams. Once a quarter, depending on India, UK, US, Europe. I get out there. Not only do I get out there, I end up taking them out for dinner and drinks. I end up doing lunches every day with a smaller group. And there's never a more valuable and productive time for me than to spend time with them, because you get to learn so much about each other. They get to learn about me as well as more about the company, answer questions that they may not be willing to ask in a broader forum. And I get to learn about them as a human being. I get to know, who has what kids, who has what type of parents, and, where the health issues are, and all the things that allow me to be personally in touch. And that's the part that I think is missing today in the hybrid world, because when you build that personal connection, you're able to go above and beyond to be able to relate and to be able to make that call and say, hey, buddy, how's it going? Do you need anything? Whereas you're just a formal ID as an employee.
Well, Piyush Mehta, this has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I've enjoyed it a great deal, and would love to do it again, actually, as we kind of move through the Inside Jam podcast. It's always good to get perspective from a CEO of your stature, and certainly best of luck with everything that you've got coming up. And we'll look forward to talking to you down the road.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great talking to you as well, Doug. And as we drive our vision of data democratization into fruition, we look forward to keeping you guys updated.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.